All right, I'm going to go through a quick process of using a combination hand plane. In this case, a Sargent 1080 rebranded Fulton 5329. It's virtually identical to a Stanley 45 to make this molding profile here. Just as a simple example of what you can do with a plane and preparing the irons, preparing the stock, and making the cuts. So step number one is going to be to sharpen the iron. We're going to use a 1/8 inch beading cutter or rounding cutter to make the narrow round here. See in the profile. We'll use a 1/2 inch rounding cutter or beading cutter with the fence covering half of the cutter to make this half round. And then we'll use a rabbet plane to produce the flat out here. So step one is to sharpen the cutter. Obviously flattening the back is just like any other iron, pretty straightforward process. Honing the bevel, also very straightforward like any other iron, but sharpening inside the groove is where it gets a little more interesting, and I'll show you what I do and how I do it.
See if I can get that in the light. It's pretty much a mirror now. So, just a couple passes here. That's as far as we're going to go. We are not going to bother to go to 12,000 grit. That's 8,000 grit. That's very, very sharp. So, okay. Now we're going to repeat the process on the bevel. Since I do have some material to remove on the bevel because of the rust on the back and the pitting, we'll go right back to 1,000 grit. I'm going to go 30 on the primary. And all I will do is a primary bevel. I can see this was actually factory ground to 35. So I'm not going to re-grind the bevel, change the angle of it unnecessarily. It's unnecessary wear, so we will shorten this up to a 35 degree. I'm not a freehand sharpener. Not a skill that I've invested the time in, but I'm a big fan of the Veritas. It works quite well. It's not cheap, but you get what you pay for. Yep, 35 degrees. And I don't want to do any more than I absolutely have to because I've got to remove as much material from the hollow of the iron to keep the same size bead. It's a little different than a regular plane blade in that we're trying to preserve a contour, so we don't want to remove too much material. And I'd say we're there. The bevel looking good. Obviously we still have to sharpen in the hollow there. Folks, some folks say all you have to do is sharpen the back of the iron and it'll work. I'm sure that's true. It just won't work as well. But sharpening the profile is challenging, so I can understand why people avoid it. It's not that hard. I'm going to show you how to do it and how you do it with a jig that keeps you straight. So, 5,000 grit, very little pressure. On to 8,000 grit, and then we'll be done. Here we go. Where are we? There we are. Okay. I'm going to just make one quick pass on the back of the iron in case there's any burr, but when you go both directions, you kind of remove the burr. So I'm just going to make one pass here. So I don't want to raise a burr going the other way. All right, so now all we have is the groove. We'll go do that. Okay, going to attempt to show you how I set this up. Bench vise, a couple of pieces of wood to protect the cutter. Got the cutter in the vise. I want to make sure that it's perpendicular. It's not that critical. I just am going to try to move vertically when I sharpen it, so it's easier if the cutter is vertical. So let's put a square on the jaws of the vise. line the iron up to it, secure it. All right. We get the right size rod. In this case, 1/8 of an inch steel rod. Okay, so here's the setup. The iron is clamped in the vise. I can adjust the height, and I can reference the rod that I'm going to wrap with the appropriate abrasive paper to get the correct angle. By raising and lowering the iron, I can get the correct bevel angle. So, okay, looks like I can go both ways on this, which must mean I'm just a little bit shallow. Because if I was right on, it'd be cutting in. Oh, we're getting a nice polish on this. See if I can show you that. Probably not, but see if it'll focus. There we go. So you can see that we've got a, polished and unpolished areas in the bevel there, and we'll just work that until it's polished.
Try to show you how I determined the pattern. This actually was originally a piece of trim molding on an antique door. This is actually what I reproduced, but the original molding, same profile. And so just took the various cutters that are available in the combination planes and looked to see if they fit the profile. And as you can see, that one fits the half round at the top. And so I knew I could cut this part of the profile. This obviously was just an 1/8 inch bead, so it was pretty evident. Now the beading cutter that I used for this had slightly longer legs, and it's the one we'll use to reproduce this. So we can get that to very difficult to focus, I apologize. So, and then we just need to create this flat. Now you want to remove as much material as you can before you go to your combination plane, because combination blades are difficult to sharpen. They're very small cutters, so they remove material rather slowly. You don't want to start out with a piece of wood that is this square and plow all the way through it to make this bead, because you're going to go through a lot of material before you make the bead. So I'm going to take a square piece of stock. It'll actually be longer so I can clamp it, and I will plane it at an angle. I'll put a mark on here using a bevel gauge of what angle this is, and then I'll just use a jack plane to remove material down to that angle. Then I'll do the half round with a fence, do the beading cutter with a fence, and so then I'll have the bead and an angled piece over here, and then I can use a rabbet filletster, rabbet plane, plow plane, combination plane with a plow blade and a fence to plane that off flat. So that would make this profile. If you're doing a larger profile, you could add other cutters in there. With the 45, Stanley 45, you don't have hollows. That's only on a Stanley 55. You can't run a hollow in a 45 because you can't support the blade properly, unless you have the special aftermarket sole that was made for it, or skate that was made for the 45. It's very rare. You're better off buying a 55. So the choices with the 45 are plow blades of various widths, beading cutters. I said plow planes, plow blades, beading blades of various widths. And then you've got tongue and grooving cutters. I'm sure you've got the same set. So you've got tongue and groove cutters that have built-in depth stops in them that are adjustable. And most of the cuts back in the day, most of the kits came with sash blades. These are used for making window sash. It cuts the inside profile and the outer flat for the glazing compound. So the pane of glass essentially would sit right in here. It would sit basically like this. The glazing compound would fill in the rest of the area cut out by this, and then this is your inside profile of the window. So got the profile, bevel gauge. We'll just mark out what this angle is. So I just take my bevel gauge, square it up to the back of the stock, and as you can see, it's going to set at the appropriate angle. So I can lock it down, get my thumb out of the way, lock it down. Now I know what angle to rough plane my stock to remove the bulk of the material before I start using the combination plane. So I'll go mark that on the stock. So here's a piece of stock. It's just a piece of scrap ash, I believe. Could be pine. So take my bevel gauge. If I can show you this. Position it up here so I don't waste too much material. I don't really want to plane any more than I have to, so I want to be right at the top. There's what I can remove. Do the same on the other side, make sure I'm marking in the same direction. That way I can look at both ends of my stock and decide when I have it planed down to the right profile to start using the combination plane. Okay, so I've marked off my waist on both sides. If I did it in the same direction, I did. So now I can clamp that up. Just use a jack plane, joiner plane, whatever you want to remove that material. Okay, I just grabbed my old standby. It's a Sigley STS number 7. So a little bit big for this job. A 5 would be better, but my 7 is always ready to go. So in fact, the iron is probably pretty close to positioned already. Angle my plane over the approximate angle that I want to match. Start taking my corner off. And let me show you where we are. So, as you can see, I've removed the material down to my line. That's the excess. So, pretty good position there. All right, I'll need both skates to support the wide iron. So a skate will go behind each one of the prongs of the iron. So I start with the iron, insert the iron in the plane. It's a little different on a Sargent made plane than it is a Stanley. 2 points of contact here. It's not as hard as I'm making it look, but I'm doing it in an awkward angle for the benefit of the camera. I've missed the connection point. There we go. Okay, just tighten the blade holder in just a wee bit, not very tight. I'm going to slide the other skate over carefully, and I want to make sure that the skate slides just in behind this cutter. I don't want to hit the edge and damage it. Might have to wiggle the blade just a little bit, apply a little pressure to get your skate to go behind it. In this case, I'm going to loosen the iron slightly, and the skate slid right behind. So you should be able to see that. So the skate, I want the skate parallel on the outside edge here. So I can tighten my iron back in, and it's going to automatically be parallel with the inside skate. It's the way it's designed. So now I've got my iron in a little too tight because I have to adjust the depth still. I've got my outer fence parallel with the outside of the blade, so I need to lock our outer skate. I need to lock the skate down. So now the cutter is supported on each side by a skate. If you can see the cutter right here, one prong behind one skate, the other prong behind the other. On the 1/8 inch beading plane, you don't necessarily need to do that. The smaller irons, you don't necessarily need to support both sides. At the 1/8 inch, I have done it with both skates, but I think it's unnecessary and problematic, trying to keep the skates tracking so close they can interfere with your work. So we won't be doing that on the 1/8 inch cutter. Right, so now Need to set the fence, and I want the fence to cover half the width of the iron because I'm doing a half round. So I'll slide my fence in. It's in the high position, so it'll slide over, and I'm just going to eyeball this. I'm not going to get too critical about it. And that would be a half round right there. Lock my fence in. While you're doing this, in the process of using your combination plane, periodically check your rod screws because they will tend to work loose. And if your rods are moving, everything comes out of adjustment and your profile just is lost. So periodically stop and check your rod screws, check your skate thumb screws, and your fence thumb screws. Just whenever you stop for a few minutes. Okay. Now, I want the iron set so it's barely taking a cut. And you won't readjust the iron once it's set. Now, hopefully you can see the iron. Yeah, you can see it. Here's the iron up here. Here's the bottom of the skate. I don't need to continue to drop the iron deeper for the cut because the skates ride in the groove cut by the iron. So as the iron cuts and removes material, the skate tracks in that groove and will continue to sink. So it will continue to cut wood indefinitely, which we'll use a depth adjuster, depth stop to control that. I think I'm set up here, so I'm just going to test it real quick and see if it's making contact. It's going to be kind of close. Oh yeah, it's probably too much, believe it or not, and it really doesn't look like it's. Try to put my screwdriver tip on there. It really doesn't look like it's projecting beyond the bottom of the skate much, but it is a little too much, so we're going to bring it back. You just want to whisper shaving. Anything more, you'll start to get chatter. And it'll just be a lot of work to push. You don't want that. So, you're removing so little material. So I'm just putting it on here and just pushing it to see if it's cutting. There we go. Okay, so this is almost no resistance. I haven't locked the cutter in yet. It's just snug, but almost no resistance going down there. And I've got a shaving that is probably 1.5 thou. And you can see, look how narrow it is. See, there's very little resistance here. Okay, so I can lock my cutter, tighten the lock on that. Fence is set, depth is set. Now I just have to make sure I keep the fence square against the stock so that the profile is in the right position. And we're cutting. Here we go. And I'm cutting, I can tell by looking at that shaving, it's probably 1 thou, which is a little bit light, maybe 1/2 thou. I can afford to go a little heavier. Got a couple of tool marks down here where the blade's big, and I just want to take those out. Okay. Yeah, that'll do. All right. Well, we're going to change. We're going to go to the 1/8 beading cutter here. Okay. Bring up the cutter. Truthfully, it's pretty easy if I just retract the cutter. I want that skate to run the same groove. That's what I want. So let's just retract the cutter and drop the skate in. There we go. That's what we want. Okay. Let's back that out. That's too much.
I just want to whisper. I just want to kiss the wood the first time through. And that's too much.
All right, let's see if we can capture running the rabbet filletster plane to finish out this piece of molding. So let me adjust my fence, make sure I'm in where I want to be, and I am. Should be, I've been using it. Hopefully the depth is set where it's not taking too big of a bite. It's not. Keep that fence up against and run that iron. Now, these planes will clog really fast. So you need to clear your chips every pass. And if you clear them every pass, it's easy to do. If you don't, they get really jammed. Okay, now I'm a little shallow on my cut. I want to be a little further in because I'm leaving just a little bit of a ridge. So I'll move my fence out slightly. My blade projects just a little bit from the side of the plane, so I don't want to get right up against that bead or I'll groove it, which is where I am now. Come off just about a 32nd of an inch. It's hard to do with a not very precise fence adjustment. Here we go. Doesn't do a lot of good to make a video showing you using a combination plane if I don't show you some of the setup. So I'm using a Fulton 5389. That is a Sargent 1080 combination plane. It's Sargent's version of the Stanley 45. They're very similar. The blade engagement mechanism is different. I like the one on the Sargent. I think it's a little more positive than the pin on the Stanley, but I don't know if the pin on the Stanley ever failed anybody. But the cutters are not interchangeable between the two brands for that reason. Otherwise, they have all the same features. Now, this is an older Sargent 1080, and it has a waffle grip. The Stanley 45s have a wood knob, and the later Sargent 1080 and the last of the Fulton 5389s had the wooden knob. But this is an older version, prior to 1927. Immaterial. At any rate, so I'm using a beading cutter. It is the number 20 beading cutter. And the way I've got it set up in here, I don't know if I can give you a good view of it. I am doing half the bead. I'm looking at the camera while I'm rotating the plane, so pardon me while I try to give you a view of this. I don't know that I can. Maybe there, yeah. So you can see only half the beading cutter is exposed. So I'm doing a half round. So I'm going to use the fence to hold the beading cutter off.